The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late March of 1878, smelling faintly of wood smoke and bearing a postmark from a place called Harlan Creek, Kansas. And when Celia Turner read it for the third time at her kitchen table in Cincinnati, Ohio, she finally allowed herself to believe that her life was about to change entirely. She had placed the advertisement herself, 6 weeks prior, through the agency on 4th Street. It had cost her the last of her saved pin money and a great deal of her pride, and she had written the words carefully, choosing each one the way a seamstress chooses thread, for strength as much as color. She had described herself honestly, 24 years old. Brown hair, gray eyes, capable with a needle and with a kitchen stove. She had mentioned her late mother and her absent father, her skill at keeping household accounts, her willingness to relocate. She had not mentioned that she was running from something, because she suspected any man reading the advertisements in a frontier gazette understood that all the women placing them were running from something. His letter was brief. His name was Grant Barnett. He was 30 years old, a cattle rancher outside Harlan Creek. He had 460 acres, a 2-year-old homestead house he described as solid and still needing work, and no family remaining that he was willing to speak of in a first letter. He had one hired hand. He needed a wife who was practical and who would not be frightened by hard weather or hard work, and he wrote those requirements as plainly as if he were describing the specifications for a fence post. At the bottom of the letter, almost as an afterthought, he had added one line that made Celia fold the paper to her chest and breathe slowly until her heart steadied. He had written, "I will be honest with you, and I will be fair with you. That is the most I can promise, but I promise it without reservation." She had known men who promised love and delivered cruelty. She had known men who promised protection and delivered only their own convenience. A man who promised honesty and fairness and meant it in his bones, that was something rarer than she had encountered in 24 years of Ohio living. She wrote back the same evening. She said yes. The journey west took 11 days by rail and stagecoach, and by the time the dusty Concord coach rolled into Harlan Creek on the afternoon of April the 14th, Celia had lost her hat twice to the wind through the stage window, had shared the bench with a traveling preacher who snored through 4 entire counties, had eaten hardtack and dried beef until she thought she might cry at the mere sight of bread, and had revised her mental image of Grant Barnett roughly 100 times. Sometimes she imagined a grizzled, heavy man with a tobacco-stained beard and eyes like a closed door. Sometimes she imagined someone younger, uncertain of himself, hiding loneliness behind that spare and formal prose. She tried not to imagine anything at all, but the mind does not obey instructions when the heart is frightened. Harlan Creek was smaller than she expected, which was saying something, because she had expected very little. A main street of packed red-brown earth, a general store with a covered porch, a livery, a 2-room schoolhouse, a saloon called the Dusty Miller, a church with a cracked bell visible through the open belfry, and a scattering of frame buildings and sod structures backing against the low prairie hills. The sky above it all was enormous, bigger than any sky Celia had ever seen, broader and bluer, and somehow more demanding than the polite Ohio sky she had grown up under, as if this sky expected something of the people living beneath it. The coach stopped in front of the general store. The driver handed down the baggage with the indifference of a man who had done the same thing 10,000 times, and Celia stepped onto the packed earth with her 2 traveling cases and her carpet bag and her repaired hat. And she looked around at this place that was going to be her life, and she felt, for just a moment, the very particular terror of having stepped off a cliff and not yet landed. She heard her name, Miss Turner. It was not a question. It was low and steady, and it came from a man standing a few feet to her left, holding his hat in both hands, watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. He was tall. She had not anticipated how tall. Leaned through the shoulders and chest in the way of a man who worked hard outdoors every day of his life, with long arms and calloused hands, and a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from the same pale sandstone as the bluffs on the western edge of town. His hair was dark brown, and had been recently combed, and was already being undone by the April wind. His eyes were darker than she expected, not black, but a deep, serious brown, and they were looking at her with a directness that was neither unkind nor particularly comfortable. His face was, she noted, genuinely rough, sun-darkened and wind-carved and bearing the faint white scar of some old cut along the left side of his jaw. This was not a man who had spent his years in offices or parlors. This was a man who had been shaped by the land the same way the land itself was shaped by pressure and weather and time. "Mr. Barnett," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Grant," he said. "I'd prefer Grant if that suits you." "It suits me. I'm Celia." He nodded once, as if they had just concluded a reasonable negotiation, and then he moved to pick up her 2 traveling cases before she had even reached for them. Not with the exaggerated flourish of a man performing gallantry, but simply and directly, the way he might pick up anything that needed carrying. He set them in the bed of a flat wagon hitched to a dun-colored horse that looked as spare and capable as its owner. Was the journey very hard? He asked, and the question surprised her, not because it was extraordinary, but because his tone when he asked it was genuinely careful. "Hard enough," she said honestly. "The last stretch from Dodge City was the worst. It usually is." He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a hand that was briefly and impersonally steadying at her elbow, and then he walked around and climbed up beside her with an economy of movement that she would come to recognize as simply the way he was. No wasted gesture, no wasted word, but nothing absent either. They drove out of Harlan Creek heading northwest, the wagon road cutting through grassland that was greening slowly in the April warmth, and for the first 10 minutes neither of them spoke, and Celia discovered that the silence was not uncomfortable the way silences with strangers usually were. It had a different quality, watchful rather than awkward, the silence of 2 people assessing rather than 2 people failing to connect. "I want to tell you something before we reach the place," Grant said finally, "so that you have the full picture." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. "The house is good. 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, real glass in the windows, a proper stove. It is not finished in every particular. I have been meaning to hang proper shutters for 2 winters running and have not managed it. The land around it is what I told you, a little over 400 acres. Good grass, good water from the creek. The work is real and it is constant, and the winters here are harder than Ohio winters." He paused. "I am not an easy man. I have been told that more than once, and I have no reason to doubt it. I work too much and I talk too little, and I have a temper I keep well enough leashed, but that exists. I wanted you to know those things directly rather than discover them." Celia absorbed this. She thought about how rare it was for a man to say such things, to list his faults before his merits, to give a woman information rather than an illusion. "I appreciate that," she said. He glanced at her then briefly, as if checking whether she meant it. "I appreciate it genuinely," she said more firmly. "I have had enough of illusions to last me quite some time." Something in his expression shifted at that, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, a very small adjustment, the way a door opens just an inch in a house where the windows are all shut. "All right," he said. "Good." They did not speak again for another mile, and then Celia said, "My mother died 2 years ago. My father left before I was old enough to remember him clearly. I have been keeping my aunt's household since I was 17, and my aunt died this past winter and left the house to her son, who is married, and there was no longer a place for me there. I am telling you this directly also." "I understand," Grant said, and his voice carried something that she thought might have been recognition, the particular understanding of someone who had also arranged their life around loss. "I know how to work," she said. "I am not afraid of it." "I didn't think you were," he said. "Not from your letter." They came over a low rise and the homestead came into view below them, and Celia's breath caught, Not because it was not grand, but because it was real. A low, broad-shouldered house of dressed timber set back from a creek bend, with a barn behind it and a chicken coop and a kitchen garden plot already staked out for planting. And beyond it, the great rolling Kansas grassland running away in every direction until it met that demanding blue sky. Cottonwood trees lined the creek, pale-trunked and beginning to show the first faint green of their spring leaves. "There it is," Grant said, and the two words carried something that was not quite pride and not quite apology and was actually, she realized, a form of hope. The hope of a man showing something he cared about and not yet knowing if it would be received. "It's real," she said, and she knew that was an odd thing to say, but she meant it in the deepest sense. It was solid and actual, and it was nothing like a performance. And after a year and a half of feeling like every part of her life was a borrowed arrangement, the solidity of it moved her in a way she had not anticipated. "It's real," Grant agreed, with the faintest note of something that might have been, in a different man, a smile. They were married the following morning at the church in Harlan Creek, in front of the Reverend Josiah Cal and two witnesses who turned out to be the general store owner, a round and cheerful man named Henderson Prout, and his wife Dorothea, who wept gently into a handkerchief through the entire brief ceremony, with the uncomplicated sentimentality of a woman who cried at any wedding that was in her line of sight. Grant stood straight and said his words clearly, and when the moment came to take her hand, he did so with a gravity that was not stiff but simply serious, the seriousness of a man who meant what he was doing. His hand was warm and much larger than hers and entirely certain. Celia said her own words clearly, looking at his profile in the light coming through the church's plain glass windows, thinking that his face in that morning light was not exactly handsome in the easy way that men sometimes were, but was something that would, she suspected, hold up across time, the way well-made things do built for use rather than decoration. Afterward, Henderson Prout shook Grant's hand with genuine warmth and told Celia that she was a welcome addition to the community, and that his wife would call on her in a few days with something for the house. Dorothea Prout, still pink-eyed from her weeping, pressed Celia's hands between her own and said, with the directness of a woman who had known Grant Barnett for several years, "He is a good man. He will not always show you that easily, but he is. You hold on to that when the days are hard." Celia thanked her and stored that away in her mind like a coal banked carefully against the cold. The drive back to the homestead was quieter than the drive in had been, in the particular way that things become quiet when the decisive step has been taken and the ordinary life on the other side of it begins. Celia sat beside her husband, a word that sat strangely in her mind, a word she was still holding at arm's length to examine, and watched the Kansas landscape unfold around them, and thought that she was 24 years old and had married a man she had known for less than 24 hours, and that the mathematics of that were alarming, and also that she felt, improbably, less frightened than she had felt at any point in the preceding year. Grant's hired man was a young Texan named Eli Sharp, who was perhaps 20 years old, and had an open face and the kind of enthusiastic goodwill that belongs specifically to young men who have not yet had it discouraged out of them. He was waiting at the homestead when they returned, and he had apparently in their absence attempted to make the house more presentable, because there were fresh-cut cottonwood branches in a tin cup on the table, and the floor had been swept, and the smell of coffee was coming from the stove. "Mrs. Barnett," Eli said, with a formality that cost him visible effort not to break into a grin underneath, "welcome home." "Thank you, Eli," she said, and he turned red to the ears and found something urgent to attend to in the barn. Grant watched him go with an expression that was the closest thing to fond amusement she had yet seen on his face. "He is a good worker," he said. "Better than most his age. He seems very kind," Celia said. "He is that also." Grant set her bags inside the door and looked around the house with a brief, appraising look as if seeing it newly through her eyes, I'll show you where things are. Then I need to get back to the fence on the north pasture. I left it half done this morning to come and fetch you. Show me and then go, she said. I can find the rest myself. He looked at her with that measuring expression again, and this time she saw something in it shift more decisively, not yet warmth, but the beginning of something, the very first light of it at the edge of a dark horizon. The first weeks were a learning, the way all new lives are a learning, and Celia learned fast because she had always learned fast and because she had no choice. She learned the rhythms of the homestead, the early rising before the sun, the order of the chores, which were the chickens that would come to feed from her hand, and which were the ones that would peck at her boots until she made peace with them on their own terms. She learned the kitchen garden and what it needed and how to work in the Kansas sun without being flattened by the afternoon heat. She learned the deep artesian well behind the house and the way the creek ran higher after rain and lower in the late summer. She learned that Grant was up before she was every morning, had already done the first round of barn chores before she put the coffee on, and that he came in from the fields at midday and ate whatever she set before him without complaint, and with a concentration that she eventually recognized as actual pleasure. The pleasure of a man who had been eating his own indifferent cooking for 2 years, and had quietly stopped noticing how tired of it he was until something better arrived. She learned him more slowly and more carefully, because he was more complicated than the homestead, and she was cautious with complicated things. He was, as he had said, not easy. He worked from before dawn until after dark, and held himself at a slight remove from ease the way some people hold themselves away from fire, close enough to feel the warmth but careful of the burning. He did not volunteer much about himself. He answered questions when asked, fully and honestly, but he did not reach out conversationally the way some people do, offering threads for others to take hold of. In the first week she learned that he had come west from Missouri in 1874, that he had no living family, that he had worked for 2 years as a hired hand on another operation before filing for his own homestead claim. She learned these things the way she learned the homestead, by asking, by watching, by paying attention to the things that were said and the things that were specifically not said. What she also learned in those first weeks, what accumulated around her like the spring warmth accumulating in the Kansas earth, was the quieter thing he had told her about the fairness, the honesty. He was scrupulously fair. When there was hard work to be done and she offered to help with it, he did not refuse her help out of pretense or dismiss her capability. He worked alongside her with the same even steadiness he brought to everything. He kept his word in every small particular. He was direct with her in a way that required no interpretation. What he said was what he meant, and there was no undercurrent of something else, no meanness lurking under the surface of politeness. She had been braced for that undercurrent the way you brace for a blow you have been taught to expect, and the absence of it was so profound and so continuous that it eventually stopped surprising her and simply became the texture of her days. 16 days after her arrival, a cold spring rain came in from the northwest and set in for the day, and the fields were too wet for any outside work, and Grant came into the house at mid-morning and found her mending a tear in one of his work shirts and sat down across the table from her, and without particular ceremony, began talking. Not about the homestead or the work or the practical things they usually discussed, but about Missouri, about the town he had grown up in, about his father who had been a blacksmith and his mother who had been, he said, the most stubborn woman he had ever known, which he meant entirely as a compliment. He talked about coming west, about the 2 years of hired work before he got his own land, about what it had felt like to break the first ground on his own claim, a particular feeling he seemed to have difficulty naming and so described around instead, speaking of standing in the turned earth in the low October light, and understanding that this was something he had actually made. Celia set down the mending and listened to him the way you listen to something you have been waiting to hear. She did not interrupt. She asked one question when he paused, a careful question, and he answered it and kept talking, and the rain came down outside the real glass windows, and the coffee grew cold in their cups, and neither of them moved to reheat it. He talked for 2 hours. She did not know from his manner whether this was unusual for him. She suspected it was, but she understood instinctively that it required a certain kind of receiving, and she gave it that. At the end of it, he looked slightly surprised at himself, the way a man looks when he's said more than he planned, and is taking stock of whether that was a mistake. "You are very easy to talk to," he said, and it came out with a slight roughness that suggested it was a more significant admission than the words alone conveyed. "You are too," she said honestly. "When you talk." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something like one from the direction of one, and it was the handsomest thing she had seen on his face so far. The summer arrived the way Kansas summers arrive, without apology, with heat that rose from the earth as much as it fell from the sky. By June, Celia had established herself in the rhythms of the place as thoroughly as if she had always lived there, and the homestead, which had had the feel of a functional but unfinished place when she arrived, had taken on the warmer texture of a home. There were curtains at the windows now, made from calico she had bought from Henderson Pruitt's store. There were herbs drying in the kitchen, and a proper garden coming up green and vigorous in its staked-out plot. She had made peace with the chickens on broadly equitable terms. Grant had installed the shutters in mid-May, working on a Sunday with a focused intensity and a very few choice words spoken quietly under his breath when the second pair refused to hang true. And when they were finally done, he stood back and looked at them with an expression of such comprehensive satisfaction that Celia had laughed, a bright, genuine laugh that surprised them both. And he had turned to look at her with those dark, serious eyes, and something in his face had moved in a way she could not describe but filed away carefully. Henderson and Dorothea Pruitt had come to call as promised, and behind them had come other Harlan Creek neighbors, the Maddox family from the next claim over, with their 3 red-haired children and their easy friendliness. A woman named Ruby Tilson, who lived on the eastern edge of town and worked as the seamstress and schoolteacher, and seemed to be the person in Harlan Creek who actually organized everything that needed organizing. A taciturn older man named Walt Greer, who ran the livery and nodded at Celia as if approving of a sound purchase. Celia had not expected community. She had expected isolation, and instead she found herself woven gradually into a small and genuine world, imperfect, occasionally contentious, shaped by the same pressures and weathers that shaped everything else out here, but real. Harlan Creek was real. The people in it were real. And the land she had not expected to feel anything about, turned out to be something she felt deeply, and with increasing intensity, the way you feel deeply about anything that is demanding and honest and utterly itself. She was standing at the kitchen garden one morning in late June, her hands in the earth, pulling weeds from around the bean seedlings, when she became aware that Grant had stopped at the garden fence and was watching her. She looked up. He was holding 2 fence posts over one shoulder and had clearly been on his way to somewhere else and stopped. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You look like you belong here." He said it simply, as a statement of observed fact, and went on his way, and Celia sat back on her heels with her hands full of weeds and her heart doing something she was not entirely ready to examine. It was Ruby Tilson who said it plainly to her one July afternoon when they were sitting on the Pruitt's porch after a Sunday gathering, watching the men talk by the wagons. "He is taken with you," Ruby said, without looking at her, sipping her lemonade with the casual authority of a woman who notices things professionally. "Grant Barnett has not looked at anything the way he looks at you in the 4 years I have known him." "He is very contained," Celia said carefully. "He is," Ruby agreed. "He has had reason to be. His wife, his first wife, before he came to Kansas, she died in childbirth back in Missouri. The baby, too. He does not speak of it, but it is known." She paused. A man who has loved and lost that way and then chosen to love again is doing something extremely brave. I think he knows it. I think that is why he is careful. Celia held this information the way you hold something that explains something else, carefully, with both hands, understanding that it is fragile and important. She looked across the yard at Grant, who was talking to Henderson Prout with that spare, direct manner of his, one hand resting on the wagon wheel, the late July light falling across his face. She had known, in some nonspecific way, that there was a wound somewhere in his past. She had recognized the particular quality of his self-containment. It was not the reserve of someone cold by nature, but the reserve of someone who had learned, at great cost, to be careful of the things they could not afford to lose. She understood that. She had her own version of it. The difference was that where her wounds had made her careful about trust, his had made him careful about hope. She thought about what it meant to be a man who could lose everything and then, years later, place an advertisement in a frontier gazette and write, "I will be honest with you and I will be fair with you. That is the most I can promise." She thought it might be among the bravest things she had ever heard of. That evening, driving home from the Prouts' gathering in the long gold of the July evening, she and Grant were quiet for a stretch, and then she said, "Ruby Tilson told me about your first wife." The silence after that had a different quality than their usual silence, more careful, more edged. "I should have told you myself," he said at length. "Before the wedding, it should have been mine to say. You wrote that you had no family you were willing to speak of in a first letter," she said. "I thought that was as much as you could manage at the time. I still think so." Another silence. He was looking at the road ahead, both hands on the reins, but she could see by the set of his jaw that he was not merely looking at the road. "Her name was Margaret," he said finally. "She was 22. The baby was born early and neither of them could hold on. That was in the spring of 1874. I was in Kansas by October of the same year." "Running from something," Celia said gently, using her own words back at him. He looked at her then, a quick, hard look that softened into something more open than she had seen from him before. "Running from it," he agreed. "Or toward the only thing I could think to do, which was work until I couldn't think any more. Same thing, maybe." "Maybe," she said. "I am sorry, Grant, about Margaret, about the baby. I am genuinely sorry." "I know you are," he said. "Thank you." They drove the rest of the way home in that different silence, not the watchful silence of the early weeks, not the comfortable silence of the middle weeks, but something warmer and more specific, the silence of two people who have just moved a distance closer to each other and are absorbing the change. It was the first week of August when the trouble arrived, and like most trouble on the frontier, it arrived in the shape of something else first. The something else was a man named Cordell Vance, who rode onto the homestead on a Wednesday afternoon with two other men, and claimed that Grant's fence line had encroached on land he was intending to purchase. Vance was a large, loud man with a red face and the particular confidence of someone who had spent years using his size and volume to solve problems instead of his reasoning. And his claim was, as Grant explained to Celia afterward with tight, controlled quiet entirely without foundation. The survey markers had been placed and certified. The fence line was correct. Celia had been in the kitchen garden when the men rode up, and she stayed very still among the bean rows and listened, her hands flat in the warm earth. She watched Grant face three mounted men from the ground with his arms loose at his sides and his expression utterly unmoving, and she watched him speak in that low, even voice, and hold the line without raising his voice or his hand. And she understood that this was what courage actually looked like when it wasn't performing itself. Vance made a number of loud statements, several of which were threats of varying explicitness. Grant acknowledged each one without either backing down or escalating, and eventually the three men rode away and Grant turned back to the barn without visible drama. She came out of the garden. "Will he come back?" "Maybe," Grant said. He had his back to her, hanging a bridle on its peg. "I'll need to get the survey papers from Harlan Creek and I should speak to the county land office." Vance has been doing this to other homesteaders between here and Dodge City, filing proximity claims and hoping people won't fight it. Most don't. But you will." He turned to look at her. "I have the papers and I am in the right. I will absolutely fight it." "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, and something in his expression had that quality she had begun to identify, that slight opening, that tiny but definite movement toward her. "You were not frightened by that," he observed. "I was a little frightened," she said truthfully. "But not of him. I was more worried about whether you were all right." He looked at her for a long moment with those serious dark eyes, and she held the look steadily, and then he said, quiet and direct, "That is a new thing for me. To have someone worried about whether I am all right." "Get used to it," she said, and the words came out with more feeling than she had planned, and she turned back to the garden before her face said anything else without her permission. Grant dealt with the land claim through the proper channels with a thoroughness that left Cordell Vance no room to maneuver. He rode to Harlan Creek, retrieved his survey papers, sent a formal letter to the county land office in Dodge City, and enlisted Henderson Prout, who had known Grant for 3 years and had been present at the original survey, as a witness. The process took several weeks, but the outcome was never genuinely in doubt. The land was Grant's. Vance's claim was dismissed. He did not trouble the homestead again. In the weeks of dealing with the claim, Grant and Celia had worked alongside each other more closely than before, not because the situation required it, but because they had been drawn together by it in the natural way that shared trouble draws people. She had copied his survey documents for him in her clear, precise hand. She had sat across the table from him in the evenings while he drafted his correspondence, suggesting phrases when he asked, reading back what he had written. He had shown her the land maps and explained the markers to her, not because she needed to know, but because it had become his habit to include her in things, and she noticed that habit and valued it enormously. One evening in the middle of August he came in from the fields earlier than usual, as the sun was still well above the horizon, and found her at the table with the lamp lit and the survey papers spread before her, reading through them again to check for anything they might have missed. "Celia," he said. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway in the last of the evening light, with the sun at his back, still wearing his work coat, and his face had that expression she could now read clearly, the one she had finally named to herself as the way he looked at her when he was not quite managing to contain what he felt. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. He came in and sat down across from her, not at the far end of the table as he sometimes did, but close enough that she could have reached across and touched his hand if she had been a woman who acted before she thought. "In 3 months I have watched you take this place that was functional and half-finished and make it actual," he said. "I have watched you manage things I didn't ask you to manage and solve problems I hadn't noticed yet. I have watched you stand in my kitchen garden and look at my land and look at it like it was also yours, genuinely yours, not because you were making the best of something but because you had chosen it." He paused. The even, careful voice was still even and careful, but there was something underneath it now, something present and warm and a little raw. "I am not easy to feel things toward," he said. "I know that. And I know that feeling things for me is a complicated undertaking, but I need you to know that I am not indifferent to you. I have not been indifferent to you from approximately the first afternoon." He stopped again. "That is not said well, but it is said honestly." Celia had been very still through all of this. Now she set down the survey papers and looked at him directly, because he deserved direct looking at when he was being this brave. "Do you know what was said to me on my wedding day?" she asked. "Dorothea Prout took my hands and told me you were a good man, and that you would not always show it easily, and to hold on to that when the days were hard." "Dorothea Prout is a kind woman," Grant said carefully. "She is also right," Celia said. "I have been holding on to it. I have not found it difficult to hold on to because the evidence for it keeps appearing." She leaned forward slightly. "I came here expecting a rough man in a rough land, and you are both of those things, and you are the gentlest person I have encountered in my entire life. Not soft, not easy, gentle. There is a difference, and you are the reason I know the difference. I have been, she stopped, choosing words as carefully as he had. I have been moving toward you every day since I arrived, and I do not believe I am going to stop. The silence after that was not like any of the silences that had come before it. It was full of something warm and living and real. He reached across the table and took her hand. His fingers were warm and calloused and entirely certain around hers, the way they had been on their wedding morning in the church, and she felt the steadiness of him like something she could build on, like ground that did not shift. I am glad you came, he said. Not I love you, that would come later in its time and would be the more precious for being saved, but this, simple and complete and entirely true. I am glad you came. So am I, she said. So am I, Grant. The first Kansas summer turned into fall with a beauty that Celia had not been prepared for. The grassland went golden and then amber, and then the color of old copper, and the cottonwoods along the creek blazed yellow against the blue October sky so purely and briefly that she stopped one afternoon simply to look at them, standing at the creek bank with her skirt moving in the autumn wind, and Grant came up beside her without speaking, and they stood there together watching the cottonwood leaves come down one by one into the water. His hand found hers at her side. Not reaching, not dramatic, simply finding, as if it knew where it was going. She turned her head and looked at the side of his face. The autumn light was on him, and he was watching the cottonwoods with those serious dark eyes, and she thought that this was a face she would never tire of looking at, not because it was easy or decorative, but because it was the face of the most genuine person she had ever known, and genuineness, she had learned, is its own form of extraordinary beauty. Grant, she said. He looked at her. She had intended to say something considered and carefully worded, and she said none of it. What she said was, I love you, in the direct and unembellished way she had learned from him, and the words had the feeling of something true arriving at its destination. His expression moved through something she could not entirely track, surprise, she thought, and then a depth of feeling that she felt in her own chest as if it were a sound as much as a look. And then he turned fully toward her and said, I love you. And it was the most certain she had ever heard him, which was saying something, because he was always certain, and this was more certain than that. He kissed her for the first time at the edge of the creek in the October sunlight with the cottonwood leaves coming down around them. And it was not tentative, and it was not performative. It was the kiss of a man who felt something completely and expressed it honestly. And she kissed him back with everything in her that had been moving toward him since the moment he said her name from the packed earth in front of the Harlan Creek General Store, steady and certain, neither of them performing anything at all. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was the kind of Kansas winter that Grant had warned her about, and he had not exaggerated. The blizzard that came in late January lasted 4 days and built drifts against the barn door that required them to dig out every morning, their breath hanging white in the brutal cold. The temperature dropped to things Celia had no previous frame of reference for and stayed there. The creek froze to a depth she found remarkable. The cattle had to be broken out from the snow by hand, and Eli Sharp, who was genuinely earning his wages in that weather, worked alongside Grant until they were both moving with the particular stiffness of extreme cold, and Celia made sure there was always hot food and strong coffee waiting when they came in. She discovered, in that winter, that she was not frightened by extremity. She discovered that she had reserves she had not known about, a steadiness that matched the land's own extremity with something from inside herself. A capacity for hard days that did not exhaust her the way other things had exhausted her. She thought about her aunt's house in Cincinnati, which had been warm in winter but in which she had felt, in retrospect, constantly cold. The cold of being in a place that did not particularly want you, that tolerated you but did not see you. She was not cold here. Not once in 4 days of genuine blizzard was she cold in the way that mattered. Grant came in from the 4th night's work with ice on his beard, and a cut on his hand from the fence wire he had been breaking out, and Celia took his hand before he could object and cleaned the cut and wrapped it and looked up at him with his hand between both of hers and said, "Sit down. You are not going back out tonight." He sat down. He looked at her wrapped hands around his and then at her face, and his expression had that open warmth in it that she had now seen regularly but never taken for granted. "The cattle are in," he said. "I know they are. Eli told me. You are done for the night. You spoke to Eli." "I went to the barn for an hour this afternoon because I was tired of being inside. Eli told me the cattle were sorted and the hay was down and that you had sent him to bed already and were going to check the north fence line alone in the dark in a blizzard." "The north fence can wait until morning," she said. "You are in. You are staying in." He looked at her for a moment with that measuring look, the early version of which she had first seen from the wagon seat in the April sun, which had meant something different then and meant something much larger now. And then he said, with a quiet that was itself a kind of warmth, "All right, Celia." She made him eat and she sat across from him while he did, and they talked about ordinary things, the garden plans for the spring, what seed they needed to order from Pruett's, whether the barn roof needed work before the spring rains came, and the ordinary warmth of it in the blizzard cold was a kind of richness she held in her hands like something she would not drop. Eli Sharp, it turned out, had been corresponding with a girl from his family's county in Texas, and by March of 1879 he had worked himself up, with the encouragement of both Grant and Celia, to writing an honest letter asking her to come west. Her name was Nell, and she arrived in May, a small dark-haired girl with an astonishing quantity of practical sense and a laugh that was audible from 50 yards. And she and Eli were married at the Harlan Creek Church by Reverend Cal on a warm May afternoon, with rather more community attendance than Celia's own brief ceremony had had, because Harlan Creek had had 4 months to get excited about it. Celia stood at the church with Grant beside her, watching Eli and Nell say their words, and felt a particular happiness that was partly for them and partly something more personal, the happiness of a woman who recognized, in what she was watching, a version of her own story, and who understood by now exactly how good that story was. Grant leaned down slightly to speak quietly near her ear during the reception, when the celebratory noise was at its highest around them. "Are you thinking of our wedding?" he asked. "I am thinking of the drive to the homestead afterward," she said, "and the way you listed your faults for me on the wagon road." "I was trying to be fair to you," he said. "I know you were. It was the first moment I thought we were actually going to be all right." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, also quietly, "What was the second moment?" She thought about it honestly. "When you stopped to watch me in the kitchen garden and said I looked like I belonged there, and I saw what was on your face when you said it." "What was on my face?" he asked, and his voice had a particular quality to it, as if he genuinely wanted to know what she had seen. "Everything you were trying not to say yet," she said. "Everything." He put his hand at the small of her back, a steady and warm pressure, and kept it there while they watched Eli Sharp spin his new wife around the Pruett's front yard to the sound of a fiddle someone had produced, and the May evening was warm and golden and full of noise, and Celia leaned imperceptibly into Grant's side and felt the entire solid weight of him shift infinitesimally to steady her, as natural as breathing, as certain as the Kansas earth. In the early summer of 1879, Celia discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected it for several weeks before she told Grant, turning the knowledge over privately with a mix of emotions she needed to name to herself before she could offer them to anyone else. She was glad. She was genuinely glad, with a happiness that ran deeper than the circumstances of her life before Harlan Creek could quite account for, the happiness of someone who had thought certain things might not be for her and had discovered otherwise. She was also quietly frightened, in the way a person is frightened by the things that matter most to them, and she held that fear gently and did not let it take more room than it was owed. She knew about Margaret. She knew what Grant had lost. She thought carefully before she told him about how to say it, how to give him the full truth, including her own gladness, without making the conversation only about the fear it might reawaken. She told him one evening after supper, in the last of the long June light, sitting outside on the bench he had built against the south wall of the house where the evening was warm and the view ran down to the creek. She told him directly, watching his face. What she saw move across it was complex and layered, the way Grant's expressions always were when something hit him deeply. First a stillness, almost arrested, as if the information had stopped him mid-thought. Then something she recognized as that specific joy of his deep and private and not performed, the kind that stayed below the surface rather than flooded it. And then, very briefly, the shadow of something else, what she had expected, what she had prepared for. She reached for his hand before he could pull inward. "I know what you are thinking about," she said. He looked at her. "I am not afraid," she said. "I mean that I am some degree of afraid because it is a real thing and it has real risk. But I am not afraid in the way you might be afraid, and I am telling you that plainly so that you do not spend the next 7 months worrying about me on my behalf." He was quiet for a long moment, turning her hand over in both of his thumb moving slowly across her knuckles. "You cannot promise me anything is all right before it is over," he said very quietly. "No," she agreed. "I can't. But I can promise you that I am strong and I am healthy and that I am going to tell you everything I am feeling all the way through so that you are never managing worry alone." She paused. "You have been alone with hard things long enough." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles and kept them there for a moment. And when he looked up at her, his eyes were entirely clear and entirely present. "I am very glad," he said, and his voice had that particular roughness in it that she had learned to recognize as what he sounded like when the feeling was largest. "I want you to know that before anything else, I am very glad." "I know," she said. "I am very glad too." They sat on the bench in the warm June evening until the light went entirely, talking about what they would need and what they would do, and what the room in the sleeping loft might become. And Grant talked about the possibility of adding a room to the east side of the house before winter, which was not urgent yet, but which he wanted to begin planning. And his voice when he talked about these plans had a quality to it that was new even for him, a forward-looking warmth. A hope that was no longer being held at careful distance, but was being actively tended, the way you tend things that are growing. Doc Willis in Harlan Creek was the nearest physician, a quietly competent man in his late 50s who had been practicing medicine in the territory for 12 years. He saw Celia twice through the summer and pronounced her health excellent, and offered advice that was practical and thorough. Dorothea Prout came to call more frequently and pressed various remedies and recommendations on Celia with the warm and slightly overwhelming generosity of a woman who had herself borne 4 children and considered herself an authority on the matter, which in practical terms she largely was. The extra room was framed and roofed before August was out, Grant and Eli working on it in the evening hours and on Sundays. And by September it was finished with proper plaster walls and a window facing east. Celia made a small quilt in blue and white during the long evenings of autumn, sewing in the lamplight while Grant read or worked at the table beside her, and the ordinary domestic piece of it was so complete and so warm that she sometimes had to stop and simply sit in it for a moment, feeling the texture of it, unable quite to believe it was hers. The baby came in January of 1880, on a cold, clear night with stars like flung salt across the black Kansas sky. Doc Willis arrived in time, which Celia had prayed for, and Grant had ridden to town personally to ensure, refusing absolutely to leave that to chance. Nell Sharp sat with Celia and was a better steady presence than Celia could have asked for. Grant waited in the main room with a patience that Celia later learned cost him more than he had let on. Eli told her that Grant had walked every foot of the main room for 4 hours and had not sat down once. The baby was a boy. He arrived squalling with what Doc Willis called excellent vigor, and he was red and small and perfect, and when Grant came in and she placed the baby in his arms, she watched his face do the thing she had never seen it do before. It broke entirely open, all of it, every careful wall and watchful distance gone, and what was underneath was so large and so unguarded that it made her own eyes sting. "Hello," Grant said to his son, just that. "Hello," in the quietest voice she had ever heard from him. She felt the word in her sternum like a bell. They named him James. James Turner Barnett, because Celia's mother's name had been Jane Turner and she wanted something of her mother in the name, and because Grant said it was right to carry both families forward if they were building something meant to last. James was a loud, sturdy, active baby who slept, eventually, but never without protest, and who seemed to find the Kansas world around him perpetually interesting and worth commenting on at length. Grant, who Celia had not dared to imagine as a father in the early days of their acquaintance, turned out to be a father of extraordinary quiet competence and total devotion. The kind of devotion that is shown not in performance, but in the 10,000 small daily choices of attention. He was up in the night without being asked when James woke. He carried the baby on the morning barn rounds from the time James was old enough to be bundled, holding him in the careful way of someone who had learned that good things could be lost and was not going to be careless with this one. Celia watched her husband with their son and felt something that she did not have precise words for, a happiness with a specific quality to it. The happiness of watching someone you love be wholly themselves. The happiness of a story that had turned out to be larger and better and more real than it had any right to be when it started. Spring came back around, James's first spring, and Celia was in the kitchen garden again with the baby on a blanket on the grass nearby while she planted the new season's seeds, and she became aware of Grant at the fence exactly as she had become aware of him that long ago first summer. She looked up. He was watching her again, fence posts over one shoulder again, the April light on his face. "You look like you belong here," he said, and this time his voice had a warmth in it that it had not had the first time he said those words, a fullness, a certainty. "I do belong here," she said. "I have belonged here since approximately the first afternoon. Since before that," he said, "since you wrote your letter." She straightened up and looked at him across the fence and across the distance of almost 2 years and said, "Grant Barnett, are you being sentimental?" "Entirely," he said without embarrassment, and he smiled at her, a real, full, unguarded smile that transformed his face the way weather transforms a landscape, sudden and complete. And it was still as it had been every time she had seen it, which was not as often as she would have liked and exactly often enough to be extraordinary, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She laughed, the bright free laugh that she had learned to let out entirely without restraint in the safety of this place and this person, and James, on his blanket, startled at the sound and then laughed also, for no reason except that the people around him were glad, and Grant laughed too, a real low laugh that she would have saved in a jar if she could. And the April morning held them all, and the Kansas sky was enormous and blue above them, and the cottonwoods along the creek were coming back to life again with their pale, fresh green. Harlan Creek had grown around them in those 2 years, quietly and steadily, the way frontier towns grew when they were going to survive rather than vanish, a new family of Czech settlers to the north, who kept excellent cattle and brought preserves to every community gathering. A doctor's office that Doc Willis had finally been persuaded to establish permanently rather than operating out of his house. A proper schoolhouse to replace the 2-room one, built with community labor over 2 October Saturdays with Grant among the builders. The town had the character of a place that was planting itself in the earth and intended to stay, and Celia had become part of that character, was recognized, was known, had given and received and was woven in. She had also begun, at Ruby Tilson's instigation, helping with the teaching of the younger children 2 days a week in the autumn and winter months, when the farm work permitted it. She had discovered, to her considerable pleasure, that she was good at it, That the same quality that made her easy to talk to made her good at reaching children who were uncertain or difficult, at finding the approach that worked for a particular mind, at making the hard thing possible. Ruby Tilson, who was several years older than Celia and one of the most competent people she had ever met, became something between a close friend and a colleague over those months, and the friendship was a genuine pleasure. Grant, hearing her describe a particularly difficult Tuesday in the schoolroom in the detail and animation of someone engaged by a problem, watched her with that expression she knew and said, "You should have more hours. The children need more hours and you need more work you care about." "The homestead is work I care about," she said. "You know what I mean," he said. She did know what he meant. He meant, "You are more than this, and I want all of what you are to have room." He meant it the way he meant everything straightforwardly, without complication, as a matter of basic fairness and basic love. She went to see Ruby the following week, and they arranged 3 days instead of 2, and Celia walked into the schoolroom on the first of those 3 days with James bundled on her back and a feeling in her chest like a window opening. In the fall of 1881, when James was a determined and vocal 21 months old, and had recently discovered that he could climb most things and had made this discovery with the pure scientific joy of the very young, Celia discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she told Grant within the week. There was no shadow on his face when she told him, or rather there was the shadow, still and briefly, as she thought there might always be, because that is the nature of that kind of loss. You carry it with you, and it comes when things matter. But it was briefer, and what came after it was faster and surer and lit up his face in a way that James, watching from his position on the floor where he was attempting to build something with spoons, apparently found interesting enough to comment on. "I know," Grant said to James, looking at the baby with a smile that was already the warm and private smile he had developed specifically for James, different from any other expression Celia had ever seen on him. "Good news, isn't it?" James held up a spoon in agreement. The second baby was a girl, born in the April of 1882 on a morning that came in clear and warm, as if the year had been planning something kind. They named her Clara, after Grant's mother whose name had been Clara, and she arrived considerably more calmly than her brother had, with a quiet alertness that made Doc Willis raise his eyebrows and say she was the most watchful newborn he had delivered in 20 years of practice. "She has your eyes," Grant said to Celia, looking at the baby with that same broken-open expression she had first seen when James was placed in his arms. "She has your chin," Celia said. "Poor thing." Grant laughed, and Clara, in her father's arms, looked up at the sound with absolute concentration, and Grant looked down at her with such pure and present love that Celia felt it like warmth from a fire, radiant and real. The years built on each other. James grew from a determined climber into a determined talker, into a boy of 6, who followed his father around the homestead with the total devotion of someone who had identified the most interesting person in the world and intended to learn everything they knew. Grant took this with the patient seriousness it deserved, explaining things to his son as he would explain them to anyone, completely and without condescension. And Celia sometimes came around the corner of the barn to find the two of them in some profound consultation over a fence nail or a piece of harness, James's small face intent and serious in a way that made her heart knock sideways in her chest. Clara grew from a watchful baby into a watchful child, who had a quality of stillness that was her father's and a directness of speech that was her mother's, and who very early demonstrated a remarkable capacity for being in possession of every available fact about any situation. She was, at 4 years old, already teaching James things he had not noticed, which he accepted with brotherly ambivalence and genuine profit. Eli and Nell Sharp had a daughter of their own by 1882, a dark-haired girl they named Ruth, and the two families were so consistently in and out of each other's households that the children treated both houses as home, which was the way everyone wanted it. Eli had saved enough to file his own homestead claim on a section of land 2 miles northeast of Grant's place. And while this meant he was no longer a hired hand exactly, he and Grant had worked out an arrangement of mutual labor assistance that suited them both, and that was, Grant told Celia, a better arrangement in every practical sense. The homestead house had grown over those years. The east room that had been Clara's nursery had become a proper children's room, and Grant had added a proper front porch over a summer project that he and Eli undertook together. And there was a summer kitchen that Celia had requested, and Grant had built in a way that made the summer cooking bearable rather than punishing. The kitchen garden had expanded into what was now a genuinely productive kitchen garden, and a small orchard of apple and pear trees that were only beginning to bear fruit but showed promise. The barn had been enlarged. The fence lines were maintained and clear. The homestead had the look and the feel of something that had been built carefully, added to thoughtfully, and inhabited with love, which was exactly what it was. Celia stood on the new front porch one October evening in 1883, 5 years after arriving on a stagecoach with 2 traveling cases and an unpinned hat, watching James chase the last of the evening light across the yard, while Clara sat on the porch step sorting pebbles with the seriousness of a scientist. Grant had come out and was standing behind her, one hand on the porch post, and the cottonwoods along the creek were doing their October thing again, blazing yellow against the darkening sky, losing their leaves one by one to the evening wind that smelled of dry grass and coming winter. "Do you remember the first time we stood at the creek and watched the cottonwoods?" she said. "I do," he said. "October of '78. You turned and told me you loved me. You remember the order of it." "I remember everything about that afternoon," he said. She turned to look at him. He was watching the yard, James running, Clara and her pebbles, the last light on the grass, and his expression was the fullest, most open thing she had ever seen on a human face. 5 years and 2 children and 400 and some acres of Kansas grassland and all the weather they had ever been through, and his face when he looked at what they had made was still the thing that made her breath catch. "I wrote to a stranger," she said. "I spent 11 days on a coach and a train, and arrived in a place I had never seen to marry a man I had never met. I placed an advertisement in a frontier gazette," he said, "in full expectation of nothing, and you answered it." "We were both very brave," she said. "Or very desperate," he said, and his voice had that dry, quiet note she loved. "Both things can be true," she said. He came around the post and stood beside her properly, not at any distance, his shoulder warm against hers, his arm coming around her back in the easy way of long familiarity and continued intention, and she leaned into his side the way she had been leaning into his side for 5 years now, the way she thought she might lean for the rest of her natural life and not become tired of. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked up at him. "Tell me." His eyes came down to hers, and they were warm and dark and entirely certain, and his voice was the quiet, serious voice she had first heard saying her name from packed red earth in front of a general store, which had never once in 5 years failed to carry exactly what it meant. "I had not understood before you," he said, "what it was to have someone see you correctly, to have someone know the whole of a thing and stay in it. I had not understood what it was to have a person beside you who was genuinely there, not performing being there, not there for their own management of something, but there." He paused. "You are the reason any of this means what it means." James's voice carried across the yard. He had found something in the grass that required immediate parental attention, and was announcing this at some volume. Clara looked up from her pebbles with the expression of a child who has noted the situation and found it unsurprising. Grant didn't look away from Celia. "I love you," he said. "That is what I wanted to tell you. I say it to you regularly, and I will say it as many more times as I live, and it will mean this much every time." "I love you," she said. "The same, every time." James had reached the porch steps and was climbing them with urgency, something clutched in one small fist. "Pa, Mama, look." "Show me," Grant said, and turned to his son with the full weight of his attention, crouching down to James's level the way he always did, meeting the child where the child was, and James opened his fist to reveal a particularly excellent stone, striped with quartz, and Grant examined it with the gravity it deserved, and said it was the finest stone he had seen this week. And James turned to Celia with shining eyes, and she agreed entirely. And Clara came up the steps and climbed into Celia's arms with the effortless confidence of a child who has never once doubted her welcome, and the October evening settled around all four of them, warm and solid and real. The night came down softly. The stars came out over the Kansas grassland in their thousands. Inside the homestead house, the lamp was lit and supper was on the stove, and the children were scrubbed and fed and tucked, and resisting sleep with the passionate creativity that is apparently native to all small humans. And Grant sat on the porch for a while in the dark, the way he sometimes did, thinking. And Celia came out and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the stars in comfortable silence. The particular silence that had been theirs from the beginning, and had grown larger and warmer with every year. The silence of two people who had nothing to hide from each other and everything to be. The following spring, 1884, they planted 3 new apple trees along the south edge of the orchard, and in the summer Celia started a 3rd day of school teaching that she had been quietly planning for several months, and in the fall Grant and Eli Sharp and 3 other neighboring homesteaders formed a loose cooperative for purchasing grain and hay in quantities that gave them better terms from the merchants in Dodge City, which was a practical arrangement Grant had been thinking about for a year, and that Celia had heard out with full attention and said was a sound idea. The cooperative held together and worked well, and over time saved all 4 families meaningful amounts of money, which went back into the land and the livestock, and the small specific improvements that build a life by accumulation. There was nothing in those years without difficulty. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that tested the creek levels and required careful rationing of the garden water and a vigilance about the cattle that wore everyone to the bone. There was a sick spring for the cattle in 1885 that cost them 5 head before Doc Garrison, the new veterinarian who had come to the area in the previous year, identified the problem and solved it. There were fence-line disputes with a new neighbor who turned out, on further acquaintance, to be not malicious but genuinely ignorant of the survey conventions, which Grant addressed with patient directness and eventually resolved without lasting ill will. There was the winter of 1885 to 1886 that was ferocious even by Kansas standards, that cracked the stone walls of the livery in Harlan Creek and froze the fruits well solid for 6 days, and brought the temperature to places that Celia no longer found shocking, but still found deeply demanding. Grant and Eli lost a section of fence on the north boundary in a late February storm, and spent 2 days rebuilding it in conditions that made Celia stand at the window and send them warm thoughts with the intensity of someone transmitting by telegraph. None of it broke them. None of it came close to breaking them, because neither of them was the kind of person who broke easily, and because the thing between them, the bone-deep trust, the fundamental fairness, the love that had grown from an honest letter and a careful wagon ride into something as large and as rooted as the Kansas sky was wide, was not a fragile thing. It was what they had made it, which was something built to hold. By the spring of 1886, James was 6 years old and starting at the Harlan Creek School with the eagerness of someone who has been waiting for this particular thing for several years and intends to make the most of it. He had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and the combined effect, in a 6-year-old, was fairly remarkable. He could already read well enough that he sometimes corrected the other children's errors, with a diplomatic tact that he had clearly learned from watching adults manage similar situations. And Celia, watching him from the front of the classroom on the morning she taught, felt something so overwhelming it needed 2 names, pride and love, and also something beyond those, a wonder at the fact of him, at the fact that there he was. Clara, at 4, was producing what Grant called opinions, at a rate that he clearly found both impressive and slightly alarming. She had decided that she wanted to learn to ride by herself, not on the saddle in front of her father but on her own, and she pursued this ambition with a calm and total determination that Grant said reminded him of someone he knew. Celia accepted this description with appropriate modesty and worked with Grant on figuring out a first pony of appropriate temperament, and the acquisition of the pony, a compact, steady, brown and white animal that Eli Sharp located through a connection in Dodge City, was the occasion for a Clara happiness of such completeness that it radiated for days. Nell Sharp was pregnant again in the summer of 1886, and Celia sat with her through the July afternoons, and they talked about everything: their children and their husbands and the land and the particular quality of life out here, the ways it had exceeded and the ways it had confounded their expectations. Nell said once that she had expected to be lonely out here and had not been, and Celia said that she had expected to be frightened and had not been, or had been frightened in ways that turned out to matter less than she had thought. And they sat with that for a moment in the warm July shade, and were both quiet in the comfortable way of people who understand each other thoroughly. In the late summer of 1886, 8 years after Celia had stepped off a stagecoach into the Kansas afternoon, she and Grant were sitting after supper in the last of the August light on the front porch with their coffee, a habit they had established and maintained through all weather and all work, when Grant said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about the east pasture, and whether we might consider adding another 50 head next spring if the winter is mild." And Celia said, "I have been thinking about the east pasture also. I think we should put the orchard extension there instead." And they looked at each other, and both of them had the same expression, the fond, direct expression of two people who have been thinking separately about the same piece of land and have arrived at different answers, and are about to spend a pleasant hour and a half working out which of them is right. It turned out they were both right, in different respects, and the solution was a division of the east pasture that accommodated both plans, and this seemed to them entirely characteristic of how their years together had worked, each of them seeing something real, each of them willing to say it, and the combination of their two seeings generally producing something better than either had managed alone. James came out in his night clothes to find them still on the porch in the dark, his hair standing at angles that suggested he had been asleep, and then been visited by some thought too important to wait. He climbed into the space between them on the bench and leaned against his father and said, without introduction, "Pa, does a creek get tired?" Grant considered this with appropriate seriousness. "What do you mean by tired?" "I mean, does it want to stop moving?" "I don't think so," Grant said. "I think the moving is what it is." James absorbed this. "So if it stopped it wouldn't be a creek anymore. It would be a pond." James sat with this for a moment. "I don't want it to be a pond," he announced. "Neither do I," Grant said, and his arm had come around the boy as naturally as breathing, and James was leaning against his father's chest in the specific way of a child who has never had reason to doubt the solidity of the person they are leaning on. Celia looked at the dark water of the creek below the cottonwoods and at the stars above the Kansas grassland and at her husband and her son on the bench beside her, and she felt, as she had felt in various forms for 8 years, the particular and precise gratitude of someone who got more than they bargained for in the best possible sense. She had bargained for honesty and fairness and a solid house with glass windows. She had gotten all of those things, and she had got the rough man and the rough land exactly as advertised, and she had gotten something no advertisement could have promised or described, which was the understanding that roughness and gentleness are not opposites, that a person shaped by hard country and hard loss and hard work can carry more tenderness inside them than any soft parlor ever produced, and that the kind of gentleness that is earned rather than assumed is the most reliable kind there is. She had gotten Grant Barnett, who had promised only honesty and fairness, and had delivered, without apparent intention of doing so, the whole of himself, present and constant and warm and utterly genuine, in the way that only the bravest people are genuinely themselves, because it costs something and he had known it cost something and had done it anyway. She reached across James and found Grant's hand on his far side, and he took her hand without looking, without interrupting his answer to whatever question James had produced next, and held it with the same warmth and certainty he had held it with at the creek in October of 1878, at their wedding, at every point between, and she held his hand back with everything she was, and the Kansas night was around them, enormous and clear and full of stars. And the creek moved below the cottonwoods without intention of stopping, and the homestead house behind them was full of the accumulated warmth of everything they had built together, and everything they would yet build. The apple trees they had planted that spring had their first blossoms in early May, coming in white and fragrant against the pale green of the new grass, and Clara, who had been checking them every morning for 2 weeks, came running from the orchard one morning at such speed that Nell Sharp, who was visiting with her daughter Ruth, came out onto the porch to see what was happening. "They are blooming," Clara announced to the assembled world. "All 3, right now, come and look." And they all went, Nell and Ruth and James, who dropped what he was doing, and Celia, and Grant, who had been on his way to the barn, and turned at his daughter's voice the way he always turned at his children's voices, immediately and fully. And they stood at the edge of the new orchard in the May morning, and looked at the 3 small trees in their first bloom, white flowers against the sky, and the smell of them in the warm morning air was something new, something that had not been there before they planted it. Something they had made by choice and by labor and by care, the way everything good they had was made. Clara took her father's hand on one side and her mother's on the other, and James leaned against Celia's other side, and Grant looked at Celia over the tops of their children's heads with those dark eyes that were, in the full spring morning light, as warm and as present and as certain as they had been on every other morning she had looked into them. And she looked back at him with everything she was and everything she had, and the trees bloomed quietly in the Kansas spring, and the creek ran below them. And the sky above was as big and as blue and as demanding as it had ever been, and they were entirely equal to it, the 2 of them, together in the honest and unperforming and completely real way they had always been, right from the very first afternoon.